Okay, so we are so excited today to have David Silverman with us. He is a professor at George Washington University of History. He wrote an amazing book called This Land Is Theirs. And we wanted to have him on today to talk about the Native American history of the pilgrims when they came over and on the Mayflower, and just get his insight into what it was like at that time. And
Yeah, I mean that's the big thing is just like we don't how much do we really know? And everyone is taught in grade school the first time about the pilgrims and how they come over here, and we've celebrated them and the discovering the world and this, but really what effect did it really have on the Native Americans? And then were they really that were the Mayflower people, they were escaping for religious freedom and want to do it, but were they good people? And what kind of people were they? So why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and your what you teach and how you got into this and how you got into writing the book.
Sure. And thank you for having me here. I'm a professor of history at George Washington University. I've taught there since 2003. My subject areas are Native American, Colonial American, and American racial history. I've written 5 books and edited several others. They've focused disproportionately on Native people in the Northeast, though increasingly I'm ranging continent-wide. In terms of why I wrote this particular book, I would say there were 2 main reasons. The first was the first book I wrote many years ago was about the Wampanoag people of Martha's Vineyard. And during the course of writing that book, I reached out to historically minded Wampanoag people and had conversations with them, not only about the historic subject material, but about their day-to-day experiences. And one of the issues that kept coming up in the course of those conversations was how difficult Thanksgiving season was for them, particularly for their kids. And adults would ruminate about how difficult it was when they were children during Thanksgiving season. And what they said was, here's a holiday that features us, and yet we're very rarely named as a group. It's just the Indians, right? Not specifically the Wampanoags, just the Indians. And more than that, more importantly, it's a holiday that celebrates colonialism. And for Native people, colonialism does not have any positive connotations. It's a story about death and dispossession. So, here we have a group of people who are our fellow Americans, let's keep in mind, who are alienated by a national holiday that makes light at best and at worst celebrates, an atrocity for them, an apocalypse for them. And it seemed to me that bringing that perspective and the very real history behind it to the fore would be of value to them, first and foremost, but also to the rest of us to think about, what are we doing when we go through this exercise year after year after year? The other reason I wrote the book is that I heard from secondary and elementary school teachers over and over again about how almost all of them teach this sanitized fairy tale, sugar-coated version of Thanksgiving. It's the one cameo that Indigenous people make in American history curriculums across the country. And yet, almost to a person, they acknowledge that they didn't have the content knowledge to teach the subject appropriately. So it seemed to me that if I wrote a book that could reach them, in turn, I could reach millions and even tens of millions of American school children about the real substantive Indigenous history of American colonial history.
That's good. Well, that's good. I mean, it's the truth. It's like when you start digging in the layers. I mean, we always get the sanitized version of history, and I think from years and years of hearing about this, I don't think a lot of people. I mean, people know that we came over here and colonized and more and more about the way when they spread the colonialism across the United States, there was a lot of unfortunate things that happened to the Indians and their land taken. Oklahoma, we deal with Oklahoma a lot, and there's a lot of going on in that. But as far as the Mayflower people and who they were and what they were coming over here and looking for, because they weren't an army of people, but they were still trying to escape something else from Europe to start something new here. What could you tell us about them? What do you know about them before they were coming over and as
Right.
they came here, and what kind of people were they?
Well, I mean, let's clear away some of the cultural baggage that we're all saddled with when we discuss the Pilgrims. I heard you use the term "we," and I think that's a great place to begin. The Thanksgiving myth, as I call it, this sugar-coated story of the Mayflower and Plymouth colony, is designed to get white people to identify with Pilgrims as we, to see them as colonial founding fathers for the country. And so it is very much a racialized message, right? Because the Native people, who are also our countrymen and women, are not we; they're they in the story. So it's a way of racially conditioning us to think of ourselves, regardless of our backgrounds. Look, my last name is Silverman, right? But I was taught that way too. It's designed to make us think as if we have a direct connection to these folks who most of us don't have any genealogical relationship to at all. Let's be clear about what these folks were trying to accomplish and what they weren't trying to accomplish. There's no question about it.
Excuse me, 1 second. It's interesting what you just said, because a lot of the work that Cindy's been doing is tying certain families of the Mayflower to certain other individuals that we'll discuss later. But everyone's thought is always that we're all genealogically connected to the people from the Mayflower, and that's not true.
Most people in this country have no genealogical connection to anyone from the colonial era. Most people in this country came from immigrants who arrived in later centuries. So the notion that English people from the colonial era are we is a way of constructing a national myth. It's not about historical truth.
No.
And so, let's get to the way we're taught about the importance of these folks. So one is they're supposed to be seen as the progenitors of American religious freedom. I think which most of us, not all of us, but most of us cherish as a national characteristic. There's no question. The Pilgrims are a radical group of Protestants at the edge of the Puritan movement, which is a reform movement within the Church of England during the time. They felt that the Church of England was so corrupt, so full of Catholic elements, that they had to separate from it entirely. So the Puritans are trying to reform the Church of England from within. The Pilgrims are separatists. They have divorced themselves from the Church of England. Well, the king is the Church of England's head. And so, that automatically means that you are out with the English state. So they could not worship freely within England. Originally, they go to the Netherlands to try to find a place of refuge. They decide they don't like life there. And so then they try to find another place where they can set up a religious community and worship as they will. And that place is going to be America, in one of these new colonies. Now, let's be clear. Even though they want religious freedom for themselves, they have no commitment to religious freedom for other people. And what they want to do is set up a religiously intolerant state where their faith is the one true faith. So even if you were a Protestant who disagreed with them, you did not have liberty of conscience within their colony. Never mind if you were Catholic or of some other faith. We also are taught that they're the progenitors of American democracy. Originally, the Mayflower was going to land on the banks of the Hudson River, but they had a difficult time getting around Cape Cod, so they decided to stay in New England. Because they had not originally planned to go to that location, anarchy breaks out. And, some of the servants on the ship say, oh, we don't have to follow the leadership of this venture if we're gonna land there. So they set up an agreement that majority rule will be the order of the day. Let's be clear. It's not as if they invented such an idea. No, England was a functioning democracy at the time. So, the notion that all of America's democratic traditions spring from this moment, I think, is stretching it just a little bit.
Yeah. So they're basically, from the way you describe it, and the religious intolerance, and they just want to stay with their own group. It almost sounds like a cult they want to set up over here.
That's what their critics would have called them. I mean, sure, they are a deeply committed group of radical Protestants. Yet religion infused every aspect of their lives. And, one of the reasons that they're intolerant toward others is they really did believe that if they tolerated people of different minds, that they were corrupting their own souls. I mean, that they were really damning themselves in the afterlife, and one has to take those views seriously. It's a very early modern mindset.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting because Cindy has been doing genealogical research on the Mayflower for a while now, and she's been able to tie several of the families to all of the major serial killers in the United States.
Okay.
It's insane. I mean, we were just like, when we started, we're like, what? And it's all of them. Like, whenever there's, like, even right now, the Idaho killer, she was able to plug him into the trees and find out that he originates from one of the families that was on the Mayflower. So what we're trying to figure out is we do a lot of work with true crime, and trying to figure out if there's some substance to the fact that this group of people, their DNA was twisted in some way, that this is what's happened, that all of these serial killers have sprung from them. But also, when they arrived in Massachusetts, there's a lot of research that we've been reading about how the Native Americans did not like the land that they were on. Like, that land, they believed there was something cursed on that land. So they moved. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but that's some of the research that we had found, that some of the land that some of the pilgrims landed on outside of Plymouth, Native Americans moved from.
Well, there had been a massive epidemic in southern New England in the handful of years before the Mayflower arrived. So this epidemic, which is almost certainly introduced by a European ship, inadvertently, let's be clear, but introduced by a European ship to the native population, eviscerates the native population between southern Maine and what's now Rhode Island. And so that's the core of Wampanoag territory here. Think effectively from the New Hampshire-Maine border all the way along the Massachusetts coast until you reach Providence, Rhode Island. We don't know the exact number of people lost to this disease. We don't even know what the disease was. The English just called it a plague, not the plague, but a plague, a general disease. But native testimony said that some entire villages were wiped out, and in others, the vast majority of the people were dead. One of the places that got hit was a Wampanoag community called Patuxet, which is precisely where the English build Plymouth. One of the reasons they build there is that the native people had either died off or vacated the place, and the land was already clear because Wampanoag people cultivated corn, beans, and squash. So that meant these English newcomers, who are not very many and pretty sickly themselves, didn't have to do that really hard labor of clearing the land. Whether there's some kind of genetic disposition to serial killing among space, I mean, who's to say? I mean, I certainly don't have that kind of expertise. What I can say is that the horrific violence that these folks perpetrated on Native people and received in kind is not particular to them. It's a characteristic of colonialism wherever it happens, because colonialism is fundamentally about people from Europe stealing the land of the indigenous people and then murdering them if they won't comply. And so, that's a recipe for nonstop violence.
Yeah. And I think what's also interesting is how we're taught from such an early age a totally different story. Why do you think that is?
Oh, Americans don't want to confront the bloody history of this country. We can barely even muster the word race without getting half the population in a knot. Never mind genocide. And the fact of the matter is, this was a continent populated by human beings before Europeans arrived. It was not a wilderness. It was not a new world. It was not a virgin land. It was a continent covered with civilizations and millions of people. And those people did not welcome Europeans to come take their country, which is effectively what the Thanksgiving story is all about, people making friends and then the natives just disappear. Well, that is not how it went. Colonialism was and is a very bloody business. And the kind of colonialism that we see in the Americas is designed to replace the indigenous people on the land with settlers who then, use the land for their own. To confront that story means that we have to treat history as a critical view of our own society instead of an exercise that cultivates patriotism. And that's the fundamental debate our society is having right now, is that half the population subscribes to a very old idea. I mean, this is as ancient as human beings. That the point of a history education is to make you proud of your society. Scholars like me don't care whether you're proud or not. That's not the point. Our point is to help you understand a complex past in all of its complexity. Full stop.
Yeah, and every civilization on the planet has a tawdry past of violence.
Sure.
And so it's like that's why they don't really understand that and and embrace it and realize, hey, listen, we started out in the fire, but now we've kind of evolved into something better than it was before. So,
but not every country has an intellectual tradition of claiming that God blessed their country to bring democracy, opportunity, and Christianity to the rest of the world. And that's where it's particularly urgent in the United States to challenge this myth making, because what it does is it makes us chauvinistic and jingoistic towards the rest of the world and blinds us to the repair that we have to do in our own society to bring everyone into the mainstream.
Yeah. What else do you know about the Mayflower participants? The settlers, as far as the individual thing, because there was like 100 people, 105 people on the initial excursion, and they lost about half of those in the first year, and then those families. What could you tell us about those families that came over?
Well, I mean, we've already addressed their religious orientation. Most of them were not trained in their youth to do the kind of work as peasants that they were going to have to do in Plymouth Colony. Mm-hmm. These are mostly village people and town folk who did trade work, like tailoring, and these are craftsmen. And so to have them till the soil and fish, for many of them, this is the first time they were doing it. They were kind of city slickers in effect. And so, that was a heavy lift. This is where the Thanksgiving myth is actually onto something. These folks never would have made it without the assistance of the Wampanoags. The Wampanoags permitted them to settle in their country. This is not an armed invasion. Not yet, because they saw an advantage to having them around, mostly so that they could get access to European trade goods. The Europeans have metal. Native people didn't have metal. You have access to metal for the first time. You're going to take that chance, right? And they're not a very intimidating group. And so, the Wampanoags teach them how to grow a crop that none of them had ever seen before, corn, right? They teach them how to fish. These folks had never fished before. They taught them where to fish and provided them with defense against other native people in the region, many of whom wanted to wipe these folks out. There had been a 100-year history of violent encounter between European ships and native people in this region. Many native people, for good reason, did not trust these folks. So they are not an armed invasion force. What they do, however, is create the beachhead for a massive influx of English people, less to Plymouth Colony than to Massachusetts Bay, a little ways to the north. And that's going to change the tide.
Yeah. So I want to bring in Cindy here and just can kind of give her a chance to she's been doing a lot of research with the Mayflowers and their connection to each other, and how what we found was really interesting is the connection to pretty much all the major serial killers in U.S. Now, what was interesting is that there was no connection or anything to any serial killers in Europe. So it all focused on the Americas. So, Cindy, why don't you tell David a little bit about what you discovered, and I'd like to hear his reaction for it.
So I built a serial killer family tree. There's over 70 serial killers in there. Now, granted, some, of course, have short-lived American roots. But for all the heavy, big name, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Edmund Kemper, these ones, they all tie to very specific ancestors. There's less than 20, I would say 11 to 15, where there's heavy amounts of serial killers to one ancestor, like on the Edward Fuller and Samuel Fuller. To them, also up to their grandfather, that's where they all culminate. There are 13 serial killers on that one line. Almost there are 6 Mayflower families that have no serial killers attached to them. So, but for the rest of them, there seems to be heavy amounts of serial killers drawn to that specific ancestor. Now, we know that the guesstimate, they say, is 30 million people descend from the Mayflower. That does not take pedigree collapse into consideration. There's probably more like 3 million, which is 0.9% of the population, as opposed to 10%. Of the killers in the tree, we're at 38% of serial killers descend from the Mayflower. It's a very high number. You know what I mean? When you factor those things in. So I'm wondering, I've got my theories, but for the people that landed on the Mayflower, there are a couple of families in the Massachusetts Bay Area that have high amounts of killers, like 10 to an ancestor, which is a lot. So the same people that landed here grew those serial killers. Like, that DNA is in them. It's spread. And anyways, we had been looking into some things that perhaps the land was cursed, or there's one thing I'd read, and I don't know if you know anything about this, that they were desecrating the graves so that there was some Native American burial grounds as well as European in that area, because we know it had previously been inhabited by natives and also Europeans for trading, but also that an excavation was done in that area where it seemed like there might have been some cannibalism going on. There was cut marks on the bones that they found. So I wonder if you know anything about that. We're just trying to put the pieces together, like what really happened on the Mayflower that this, like, heavy lots of serial killers descend from, each of these people.
Well, as I mentioned before, there was this epidemic that wiped out the Wampanoag community of Patuxet on the site of Plymouth. Let's be clear, though, that's not particular to Plymouth. Epidemics like this were very common in North America. And I, off the top of my head, I would say it's safe to say that most colonial settlements are on the site of a place where a major native die-off took place. That's not particular to that particular place. I have never encountered any accounts of cannibalism at Plymouth, as desperate as the place got. And one of the factors that you can attribute to that pattern is that Wampanoag people were feeding them. As opposed to, say, Jamestown, Virginia, where we do have accounts of cannibalism, because the colony was at war with its native hosts, who kept the settlement under siege. So we don't see that in Plymouth. I don't. There's nothing that stands out to me as particular about Plymouth. Other than these folks are Calvinists, and Calvinists have a lot weighing on their shoulders in the 17th century. But again, there are Calvinists all over English America at the time, so that's not particular to Plymouth.
Interesting.
Cindy, do you have any other questions for David?
No, that was my.
That was the main one.
I
I just think it's interesting how the sanitized view of Thanksgiving and the Pilgrims has been through all of our lives. From the time we can talk, go to school, we know this
right
myth, and it's interesting how now when we're doing all this research and we're finding all these other stories about the Mayflower that we had no idea. And that was one of the reasons why we wanted to speak to you today, is to get your insight on the history and what really was going on there.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, why did they go to the Netherlands first, and what happened there?
Right. So, the Netherlands was one of the very few places in Europe that welcomed people of whatever religious stripe. And the main reason is the Netherlands was underpopulated, and it was a merchant society that needed a lot of foreign expertise. And so foreign immigrants were a boon to Dutch society during that period of time. It's also a period of time in which the Protestant Netherlands was constantly on the knife's edge of war with Catholic Spain, and it wanted to bulk up its population in anticipation of the next war throughout that period of time.
So yeah, they were welcoming because of the population, and they were pretty much taking anybody they could.
That's right. I mean, even Jews could worship in the Netherlands, which was a rare thing in Western Europe at the time.
How long were they there before they decided to leave?
Oh, not long. It was like a year and a half. And some of them stay. Let's be clear. A small group of them stay in the Netherlands. Don't want to take their chances in the Americas. Most colonies, when the Mayflower set sail, up to that point had failed. And what's most significant about Plymouth colony, which otherwise is it's an underpopulated, economically marginal place, but what's significant about Plymouth is that it survives. It becomes the first English colony that lasts in New England, and provides that beachhead that becomes Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island and the like.
Right. Jensen?
As far as what happened with the Wopogs, so they left that area, and then what happened to them? Did they went to Martha's Vineyard, or?
Well, I mean, there are thousands of Wampanoags surrounding Plymouth, and I think this is actually one of the dynamics that is important to the story. It takes a while before the English are even at equal numbers with native people in the region. I mean, it's not until the 1660s that their numbers, even with the epidemics, are at even keel. So, native people are in control of that region, for most of the first several decades of colonization. Wampanoags remain in the area, surrounding English settlements, living cheek by jowl with the English. In 1675-76, though, the two people go to war because the Wampanoags are really being pushed to the limits of their patience in terms of English landed expansion, throwing their weight around in terms of trying to drive native people off the land, drive them into servitude, get them to accept English law, get them to accept Christianity and the like. And so the Wampanoags, in alliance with the Narragansetts, the Nipmucks, and several other native bands, rise up against the English colonies, and it produces one of the bloodiest wars in all of colonial American history. The English win, and they win with the assistance of more than a few native allies, and just decimate the tribes that had taken up arms against them. That said, not a few Wampanoags survived that war, and for all of the dispossession and degradation that they suffered in subsequent centuries, they're still there. There are federally recognized Wampanoag communities on Cape Cod in the case of Mashpee, and Martha's Vineyard in the case of Aquina, and there are smaller Wampanoag bands throughout the region. So they've never gone anywhere.
Well, that's good. At least they're still there. I mean, I grew up on Long Island. There's a lot of Native American land there, and there wasn't many Native Americans there when I grew up there. They were all pushed to the end of Long Island, and very small group of people, but their influence was there. Like we all were taught that this was Native American land and whatnot. But I always wondered, where do they all go? Why did we have to push them all out? Why couldn't they all just stayed and lived side by side? But I don't think.
Well, I mean, there's a very simple reason for it, and it's not misunderstanding. It's disagreement. The English wanted wanted the land for themselves, and they wanted their jurisdiction to apply. And Native people said, no, you're guests here. You're going to live by our terms. And that was a recipe for war.
Yeah. How do you think the story of the Mayflower got so sanitized? And, you know, based upon the research that you've done, I mean, what the years of research you've done with your books and stuff like that, where did you have to go to find the true story? And like, who documented this the best accurately?
Right. So let's keep in mind, Wampanoags, other Native people, were non-literate people. They didn't keep their own records. So most of what we can discern about that time is through English records, so, which means there are blind spots and biases and all sorts of problems. But that said, Native people are everywhere in these documents because they're so important to the English experience that the English simply can't ignore them. What's more, there are other European powers on the scene writing about these times and places: the Dutch, the French, what have you. You know, in terms of when this story took hold, I think you might be interested to know that even though Thanksgiving is an English holiday in England, you know, before English colonists began arriving in the Americas, and even though New England colonists celebrate Thanksgiving from the 17th century on, there's no connection between that holiday and the Mayflower story until the late 1800s. I mean, no one pays attention to the Pilgrims. It's an invention of a moment in time, centuries removed from the actual Mayflower voyage. And the effective context for the rise of this story is the massive influx of Catholic immigrants in the 19th century, Irish and German migrants, who make the old Protestant population feel very nervous about their authority in society. And so they use the Mayflower story and the story of the first Thanksgiving to assert that their ancestors were America's colonial founding fathers. And then they start teaching it in the schools. It's also a way at a time where the wars for the West, the Plains Wars, you know, are coming to an end, but they're bloody and embarrassing to the United States. The Mayflower story is a way of replacing that really difficult truth with this fairy tale of Native people and colonists making friends and then Native people getting out of the way. So that, you know, those two factors, Protestant fear of Catholic immigration and a desire to sanitize bloody Indian white relations, is really what it's all about.
So were they Protestant under Martin Luther, or were they Lutherans? Were they Methodists?
They're not Lutherans. They're dissenters from the Church of England, which is a Calvinist Protestant church, but the Pilgrims are arch Calvinists. I mean, what they're opposed to with the Church of England is that the Church of England has gotten rid of the Pope, but otherwise retained most of the features of the Catholic Church. What they say is, no, we need to purge ourselves of all the features of the Catholic Church. So, you know, no stained glass, no incense, you know, that sort of thing. Preaching directly from the Bible instead of set prayers.
Interesting.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, I didn't either.
Cindy, did you know that?
What I did know was that Martin Luther influenced the Puritans, the Huguenots, which are the French Puritans, the Quakers. That's all they're Calvinist. The Church of England. I did know that they were, the reason for all of this was that King Henry VIII, I believe, they were asking him, like, we want to get rid of all the Catholicness of this because on the surface it looks like it's not, but it is. So there's ties to Martin Luther in that respect. He influenced the Lutheranism, even the Methodist, the Puritans, the Calvinists. There are an awful lot of religions that come out of starting with Martin Luther's doctrine that spawn off from that. And so there seems to be a tie that it kind of all heads up having to do with Martin Luther. And then I think King Henry VIII, it's something to do with his wife. I think you told me about that, or is something to do with she had written a letter to Martin Luther so that King Henry.
Anne Boleyn, yeah. I'd done a lot of research about with the tutors at Cambridge, and we had come across some letters that Anne Boleyn had written to Martin Luther, but she had her own interest for that because she wanted to make sure that he wasn't going to kill her, divorce her. And she was trying to get Henry VIII, as you know, to separate from the Church of England and create his own church. But I don't know. I just didn't know that the Pilgrims were so anti-Church of England. I knew they were separatists. I knew that they were anti-Church of England. But I just didn't realize that they wanted to be so secular, almost cult-like when they came to the United States, because that's what it seems like.
Right. Again, they felt like the Church of England was so hopelessly corrupt that it couldn't be purified, which is what the Puritans are all about, is purifying the Church of England. One of the features of English society during this period of time is relentless religious infighting, because with the separation from the Catholic Church, you're left with an institution in the Church of England that not everyone is on board about. And what's more, once you've removed the authority of the Pope, it opens up all kinds of questions about what the true form of Protestant Christianity should be. And you end up with these fights between Church of England men, Puritans, separatists, Quakers, Baptists, and a whole range of other fringe Protestant groups that we don't even know about anymore because they're no longer operative. So that kind of infighting effectively rollicks the country of England and its colonies in turn all the way into the late 1600s. It's not going to stabilize until the 18th century.
Yeah, and during that time, I mean, after Martin Luther posted those 95 Theses in the church, to me, I always thought it was interesting how they just decided, oh, well, this isn't really working for us. We're going to start our own thing. How you start inventing these other kind of split offs of religion. Right. And you're, in order to do that, you have to be extraordinarily persuasive to get people to believe you, to come with you with that level of, thought and worship. So it was a big marketing campaign that they'd had to do in order to get believers and followers to split off like that. And I always thought it was very bizarre that they could just, all right, well, we're going to start our own religion. We're going to start. And to me, that sounds like, and we're going to go to another country and we're going to foster it there. That sounds very cult-wise. Sounds like, Reverend Jim James, down in, South America, bringing people down there and, repopulating them to another country that they don't even belong in and starting this whole thing. It just doesn't seem very altruistic. It doesn't seem it just seems very controlling.
Well, religion during this period is about control. I mean, Everyone's fighting to establish the one true faith, not to create tolerant society. The number of people committed to any notion of religious freedom as we'd understand it is very, very small. They did exist. Roger Williams, who founds Rhode Island, is committed to liberty of conscience. Anyone can worship there who wants to. William Penn, who founds Pennsylvania, is committed to liberty of conscience. But that's it. I mean, that is it. Everywhere else, you could be persecuted if you didn't follow the state religion.
Well, look at the witch trials. What was that all about? The Salem witch trials.
Well, that too is reflective of the anxieties of Calvinists at the time. Let's be clear. Everyone in the early modern globe, whatever your description, believes in witches. Whether you're English, French, Spanish, Native American, African, what have you, they all believe in witches. And so there's always the risk of a purge of suspected witches in any given society at any given time. What happens at Salem at that particular moment, it's a convergence of a number of different forces that are making people feel very nervous about their place in the world, including whether God is still with them. England was in the middle of yet another revolution. It's called the Glorious Revolution. The Massachusetts Charter, which served as the basis of Massachusetts government, had been revoked and hadn't been replaced with anything. There was ongoing war between the English colonies and Catholic New France or Canada and its native allies. And so all those forces together, again, along with the belief in witches, created this kind of perfect storm in which, these God-fearing Puritans are slaughtering grandmothers by the handful.
Yeah.
It just seems counterintuitive. You're supposed to be worshiping, God, and religion's supposed to be about the altruism of it, and your neighbor, be friendly to your neighbor, and here you are killing everybody. It doesn't make sense.
Well, this is a society in which most of the people believed in the active presence of the devil and the need to guard against the devil's place in society. And that devil could take the form of many different kinds of people. They saw the devil in Native people, they saw the devil in Catholics, and they saw the devil in the form of witches in their own communities.
And ironically, all the serial killers descend from this group of people.
Well, maybe you're onto something here, right?
I don't know.
Well, I tell you, they don't descend from witches. They don't descend from any of the witches, the Salem witch trials. Most of them have zero connection to Salem at all. There are very specific areas that they came out of, Mayflower being the primary source.
Yeah, we just found it very interesting. And that's why we wanted to get some perspective, some historical perspective on, what they're like and, what their journey was like and why did they form together, and when they got here, what their relationship was with the Indians. Because, we've all heard the sanitized version. We know
Right.
that, that's not really what it was, just like when Christopher Columbus came over as well. It was a brutal time. And,
That's right.
it was take no prisoners. It was taking over land. They were there for a reason, resources, not much unlike what's happening today in certain regions of the world, while we get involved in wars for resources and land. Now, not so much land anymore, but for resources and making sure they're on the same page and they're thinking like, not necessarily thinking like us, but at least aligned with us.
So I've
Right.
got a question.
And, I think it's important to keep in mind here that, along with colonists' quest to engross Native American land, there's another factor too, which contributes to the violence between the groups, which is that early modern Europeans divided the world in two. There are civilized Christians and pagan savages. That's their worldview. And to be a pagan savage in their mind is to be a human being of lesser value than a civilized Christian. And that's the lens they used to view Native people, which meant that when they could, once they gained the upper hand, they treated them with a callousness that no one would tolerate.
Do you know anything about the merchant adventurers that recruited the pilgrims, the Puritans, for the journey? You know anything about them?
Sure. What are you interested in?
Well, no, I'm just wondering because it was a very specific group. Some of the killers descend from one or two of them, but I know that they had the Puritans procured funds from the merchant adventurers, but it was the merchant adventurers who recruited them. So I was like, if you're borrowing money from these people for trade purposes, they are merchants. They funded the trip basically,
Yes.
and then wanted to make money on the fur trade, on the fishing.
That's exactly right.
Right. I find it odd. Like, why are they recruiting them, and they're the ones who wanted to borrow the money from them?
Right. So
we're hand select.
The sponsors of the Mayflower voyage, like the sponsors of most colonies, are investors who want a return on their investment. Whatever the religious predilections of the colonists are neither here nor there for the investors. The colonists, their purpose in going over is to set up this religiously pure society. For the investors, it's to send over laborers who will return products that they can then profit from. And the resources that the investors are targeting early on are furs, above all, beaver pelts, foremost among them, fish, which, as Cape Cod would suggest were abundant in the region, and then whatever minerals they could happen to find. And Europeans are always on the search for gold, especially when they're exploring the American interior. And so you do end up with a constant tension between the colonists, who are really just trying to survive, and their investor friends back in England, who keep saying, why haven't you sent back any shipments of profitable goods? And if they say, we can barely feed ourselves here, give us a break. And what the investors keep writing to them is, if you don't start sending back some profitable resources soon, we're going to pull the plug on this whole thing. And the fact of the matter is, colonists could not survive in the early years without a constant flow of supplies and reinforcements from Europe. So that was a real danger.
So the natives were helping them. They were feeding them. They were teaching them how to do all these things. And they basically, thanks, but now we're going to out you and get rid of you.
Right. And native people are also the source of the furs.
Of course.
European colonists don't go and hunt these animals. Native people do. And then Europeans trade their own goods to native people for the furs, which the Europeans then sell in, back home. Right. So, there's, in every colony, there's a phase. Sometimes it's of shorter duration, sometimes it's of longer duration, in which native people are useful to the colony as military allies, as guides, and especially as fur trade partners. Eventually, though, native people are less of use to the colony than they are obstacles to engrossing land. Once you have enough colonists that they can protect themselves and they want to start expanding their agricultural enterprises, they don't want native people around anymore.
Yeah.
And of course, let's keep in mind, these are native people's homelands, which they have lived in some cases, for untold numbers of generations. They're not going to just pick up and go.
Right.
No, it's not.
You think that the natives put a curse on them?
I'm sure they cursed them daily.
I
know they still do in some cases.
Yeah.
So.
Definitely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, David. This has been enlightening and kind of gives it, like I said, we're kind of wading through this because it's all new information for us. So we're trying to figure out how we can connect some of these dots, and hearing what you know about the Mayflower and the Pilgrims and the Indians is just helps us really kind of get a better understanding and see if maybe there is something here or maybe they're not, but we're still kind of diving into this. But a lot of these connections that Cindy's found up with, because we've been doing true crime for a while now, and we always go back to the history of people and stuff like that and connect. And this is kind of an interesting kind of connection here that we're still trying to kind of flesh out. So we appreciate all your background and your expertise in this matter.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, David. It was lovely to meet you.
Cool.